What is it that destroys the church? Or we could use a number of phrases. I've got at least two of them on the handout. We're going to try to just stick with one for the screen this evening. What is it that brings the church down, breaks it apart, divides her? What is it? And I hit the button too soon, okay? All right? But is it, I'm not even going to ask it now, I'm just going to say it. It is sometimes doctrinal matters. It might be a question over who Jesus is. It might be a discussion or a disagreement over how worship should be done. And so on and so on. That does happen, has happened historically. But how many times is the church divided and damaged because of things like these two categories? Personalities. And sometimes personalities, we mean different personalities that don't click well. But also, and especially given the nature of our text of the evening, it's when we play personality wars, where we like certain personalities and leaders or influences within the church over others, and that becomes a problem. And then along that same line, preferences connects all of those together. Is it wrong to have preferences? No. You wouldn't probably make it through life as a human being without preferences. But there's a problem when those are made a problem. And when I do that, I commit an atrocity. Let's begin our reading this evening of God's Word in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. We're going to back up to verses 10 through 13, even though that is not our focal point of the evening. It is our bridge way as we get started. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 13, it's when Paul begins to explain the overall purpose of this letter. And we don't have time to look at even the whole paragraph beyond our purpose of the evening, as we've said. But notice this in 10 through 13. He says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, a.k.a. Peter, or I follow Christ. And then he gives them these three questions. And as I said, we're not going to dwell on these three verses, but just sometimes if we take these three questions, and they have a wide application for the problem of unity, for questions that even relate to things like baptism and the nature of the church. But the three questions in verse 13, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? As you read these words, and then you make your way across the page or so to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and that is our focal text of the evening, or our focus, we ask, whose church is this anyway? And you can ask that about the church as a whole, the universal church, global church, or you can bring it down and ask this church, this congregation, to whom does it, or if you want to use the idea of her, to whom does she belong? Whose church is this anyway? And there's only one answer I know to be scriptural and factual. It's that the church belongs to God. And you can put a period there, you can put an exclamation point there, however you want to put it. But sometimes by the way, when I use I tonight, when I use your tonight, those are kind of interchangeable, okay? But it tends to feel better to say I than you, okay? Sometimes I act like the church belongs to me. You ever done that? When we allow pride and rivalry and worldly wisdom and earthly metrics to come into the church, come into our hearts, and we commit something, and here's the reason for that image, we commit something that you could call a kind of spiritual vandalism. Now, it's also self-inflicted because we as the people, we make up the church. But you can think of it that way this evening as an opening metaphor. When I treat the church like it belongs to me or somebody else along with me, my group within the church, I'm in danger of committing the atrocity of spiritual vandalism. As we look into this a bit more, go with me to these three categories or three ways of summarizing this text, this sermon. That it is God who grows the church. It is God who judges the structure, the building called church, the church. And it is God who shares His wisdom. You can also put wealth there. I think there's wealth on the screen. Okay. If you wanted to, you could put a / there and put the word wisdom too on your handout. That all of this is from, because of our God. That we as the people of God, we don't belong to ourselves even then. We belong to another. Let's dig into 1 Corinthians chapter 3. We'll pick up at verse 5 this evening. The first 4 verses directly carry over from what we see in chapter 2. There's the cautionary, you need to grow up idea. And then he comes back around to what he introduced in 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 13. Different leaders and different teachers in the church. How many of you know what a lighthouse is? Okay, I didn't have you raise your hands this morning. Okay, there we go. There was an easy one. I think I saw 2 people that didn't raise their hands. I'm not going to pick on you or anything. They're incredible, aren't they? And I know times have changed, and maybe we don't need to depend on them as much as we did, but they still have a role within naval travel. But out of all the amazing things, you can make a list of all the things lighthouses can do, what's the one thing lighthouses do not do? There may be multiple answers to that one too, but here's one thing I know lighthouses don't do. They don't compete. There is no such thing, pardon my grammar, as competing lighthouses. Hold that in your mind as we read 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 9 now, that God is the one who grows the church. And those 3 little words there are there to help us hold on to the message of this paragraph in 1 Corinthians 3. The first one, the word nothing. The Corinthians are fighting over which person they follow. Which preacher, which leader. And you could put preacher there, you could put elder, you could put somebody that doesn't have an official title but has influence within a congregation. And a big part of the answer to that is realizing that at the end of the day, without God's work in a church, whether that is helping a church to get started, helping a church to grow, whatever, people like that, people like Paul and Apollos, and you could put Gantt and anybody in there, guess what they are? It's on the screen. They're nothing. Now Paul's not, and I'm not trying to put down ministers and teachers and elders and Bible class teachers and so on. That's not the point. But it is almost, you have to back up and lay this foundation that says, here they are bragging about, I follow Paul or I follow Apollos, and he says, at the end of the day, without God growing this church, we'd be nothing. We can't do anything. We might be able to share some human ideas, we might have some movement, and we might get people together, but the church will not be the church without God. So that the workers are like nothing. Let's read it in 5 through 8. 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 8. He says, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? And I don't know that he's picking on Apollos and himself specifically here. I mean, he's already mentioned Peter. He even mentioned Jesus, that's part of this. People were trying to bring Jesus. Well, I'm following the Messiah. I think Apollos here is shorthand for any other worker or teacher in Corinth or any other place. What are they, he says? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. They're people, servants that God used to help you know the gospel, to know more of the gospel, to know it better. And the word here for servant, it's not the word that we would think of as slave. It's more of the idea of someone who serves like a waiter waiting tables. Someone compared it this way, that God is the one who is choosing what is given as far as the food. God's the one that's preparing the food in the kitchen. So as long as God's in charge of that, why do you care who brings the food to your table? Whether it was Paul or Apollos or Peter or whoever it was. They're servants. Verse 6, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. And he begins to mix these ideas. You have the person bringing the food to the table. Now you have agricultural setting, an agricultural setting. I know no one here this evening knows anything about that in western Oklahoma, but he simplifies it to Paul was the first one to preach the gospel in Corinth. Go back to Acts 18, had his share of difficulties from persecution to a number of things. He says, I came and I was like the one that planted the seed of the gospel. Apollos came and followed Paul, and it was like he added some irrigation to the field. But who made it work? Who gave the growth, or yours may say the increase? Who caused the seed to germinate and the plant to grow? Well, that wasn't Paul and that wasn't Apollos. And then he says this in verse 8, he who plants and he who waters, and here's our next little word, are one. To put it in how we might say it today, it's like Paul saying to them, hey, we're on the same team. At the end of the letter in 1 Corinthians 16, he seems to clarify them just to make sure they don't think there's any bad blood between Apollos and Paul. They're not the ones fighting and arguing over who's the best. What did we say? There are no competing lighthouses. Paul and Apollos are cooperating together. They're on the same team. They're unified as those who bring, like servants, who bring the food to the table or plant seeds and water. He says they are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are, here's that last idea from this paragraph, we are God's fellow workers. We're God's farmhands, table waiters. And who are you? You are God's field, God's building. And those two words, God's building, is the segue to the next paragraph. We're not quite there yet, but let's be aware of that. So people that preach and teach, people that lead within the church, without God being in that, it's nothing. They're on the same team. They're one. Because all of us, we're all a part of this work called God's people, God's church. But we do this, don't we? You know, sometimes we have our favorites. And I'm not saying that it's outright wrong to have, maybe it's a preacher you like to hear more than another preacher, or the way that they explain things helps you and you fix your brain better. I get that. But here's some examples I'm familiar with. I know of a place where one person was studying the Bible with another person, and they had been studying for weeks, and then that person went out of town. By the way, this wasn't even in Oklahoma, so if some of you are trying to figure out who it was, good luck. And while the original, let's say the original teacher was out of town, somebody else in the same congregation immersed the person into Christ. They kind of finished the study, and the person realized they needed to be immersed immediately per biblical examples and ideas. And so instead of waiting around for the person that originally taught them to get back, the other person went ahead and baptized them. What do you think happened when the other person got back from their trip? They practically tried to divide the church over it. They got about as mad can get because somebody else came along and stole their converts. No, we don't ever have this problem today, do we? Or I'll go a little closer to home. As preachers, one of our problems is that when we hear somebody else preach, we have to fight the urge to do this. You know, that's not how I would have preached it. Or, you know, if I had that text, I would have preached it differently. Or here's another one. We don't do this, okay? But there are congregations that have 2 morning services because of capacity and things like that. And it is usually recommended when you do that, you have everything exactly the same. What do I mean? You have the same preacher preach the same sermon, the same song leader lead the same songs. I know of one congregation, they even have the same two guys lead the same two prayers. Why? Because when you don't do that, people from the morning service, they become morning service people, by the way, right? They tell the people that go to the later service, hey, you should come with us. Our song leader leads these songs we like. Or he pitches the, you see what I'm saying? What is it? There are no competing lighthouses. Why? Because it's God who gives the increase or the growth. So what do you do? That's the question. What do you do with leaders and workers in the church? Biblically, here's what you do. You pray for them. We're bringing in some other text here, kind of consistently throughout the Bible. You pray for them. You support them. You honor them when honor is due. But you don't idolize them or rank them or make some kind of competition out of them. It's God who gives the power. Now let's go back to 1 Corinthians 3. Not only are there not any competing lighthouses, just like the Holy Spirit through Paul, we're going to switch things up a bit now from the ocean or the sea to that project. Have you ever built something that didn't last very long? Maybe you're at the beach and you built the most intricate, amazing sandcastle, one that if you'd had, and it's maybe years ago, if you'd had a picture and could have posted it online, it would have went viral, okay? Is it still there? It probably didn't last but a few minutes, maybe a few hours, depending on the tide, right? But have you ever built something that did last? Some of you in here have built houses and remodeled houses, built barns and sheds. And sure, Tornado Alley and even just the wind out here, some of those may not be any around anymore, but some of them are. What's that like? To build something that has permanency. What if you could contribute to building something that touches eternity? That's 1 Corinthians 3, 10 through 17. God judges the structure. And you might notice there that I added a few extra explanatory words on the handout, like the instruction and the sobering reality out beside. I hope that doesn't throw you filling out the handout too much. But in 1 Corinthians 3, he goes from God's field and the planter and the water to you're also God's building as the church. Because of that, the instruction, the takeaway is build very carefully. This is not like the little lean-to in your backyard. This is not like the birdhouse. I mean, you might really build a birdhouse, who knows? But this is God's building. Be careful how you build it. Let's read it, 1 Corinthians 3. He says, according to the grace of God, this is verse 10, given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation. Someone else is building upon it. Paul was. We said that. Paul was the first one to preach the gospel, and in that sense, he started the church in Corinth. Apollos and others now have been there and added on. And then he says this in verse 12. Or the rest of that verse. Let each one take care how he builds. That's that build carefully. How he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation. Here's the one foundation. We were singing that earlier. Other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. If that's not where we start, we need to start all over, isn't it? And you see how this works? If that's the foundation, then anything that I contribute, anything I add or build onto that needs to be appropriate to who Jesus is, to what He stands for, to what He teaches, His humility, His compassion, His truth, His stance for the truth. It's almost like substructure, superstructure, if you want to get more technical in building terms. The foundation, the only foundation, is Jesus. what am I going to contribute on top of that? On the one hand, you say, I can't. But within the picture, it's when I teach, when I bring my presence, when I bring my encouraging words, or when I do other things. I'm either building up with good material, or I'm building down, or even using less than up to par materials. Look at it in verse 12. I was trying to get to verse 12 earlier, right? He says this, now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, what does that sound like? In their day, those are the materials you use to build temples. And then the other things are more common materials, wood, hay, straw. Each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, what you contribute on top of the foundation, he will receive a reward. Verse 15, if anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only through fire. Before we go onward, two little by the ways. Sometimes 1 Corinthians 3, 12 through 15 is applied to the idea of purgatory or the idea of lesser and greater rewards in heaven someday. Now, I am firmly not convinced that the idea of purgatory works within Scripture at all. I'm a little less certain on the other one, but let's just say this, that the immediate context of 1 Corinthians 3 is the work of leaders and teachers and ministers within the church. Think about, by comparison, think about Paul's words in Philippians 2, 16 and 17, when he tells the Philippians, you are my crown and my glory someday. So it may just be that this passage is about what happens when I work and build or contribute or tear down and break down the church. Now, can I go too far in that to where my own salvation is in danger? We're going to come back to that. But can you imagine someday, on that day, and you look back and realize what you built either didn't last or it was not appropriate to the foundation of Jesus himself. Think through that. Think about what he's discussing here. The work, the building, the structure. It's the work of working in and with and for God's people. I'm not sure the context supports those other two discussions, but more on that is for another occasion. Come back with me to 1 Corinthians. Look at these last two verses of this section as we've outlined it this evening. We said in verse 12, it sounds like temple material. And then he says this, do you not know? It's like Romans 6 this morning, don't you know? You do know. I'm just going to remind you that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you. Just like God's divine presence ascended on the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, now there is a new temple of God made up of people, not real stones anymore, but people in whom God's Spirit lives. Just like those other two with the divine presence, his presence is in us. Verse 17, he says, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. And that's where I said earlier, can I go so far in my damage to God's people by dividing, by that this verse applies to me? Seems so. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. What do you do in a temple? You worship. Temples are for that main purpose. Even idol temples, as wrong and upside down as it is, it's to worship and praise and adore the God that supposedly dwells there. So one of the ways to simplify this is what I'm doing. Helping to build up the church is what I contribute to the church as whatever role I have. Preacher, just a regular member, whatever it is, to the worship and praise of God as the church? Or are my words and my actions doing more to fracture the church of God, this church even, this congregation? You can spend your whole life, as we say, in the church. Never speak one word of false teaching. From that outright place, never practice something that is false as far as doctrine and ethics go. And still destroy the church. All you have to do is allow pride and jealousy and rivalry and tradition and preferences take over. And we say, well, that's not how we've done it before. Or sometimes it's, that wasn't how I did it when I was in charge of that. Or maybe it's grandpa or grandma. When they were alive, we did things this way. Or it's some people like the screens. Some people like songbooks. See where that comes in? Some people like pews. Some people would rather have chairs. What did we say earlier? Having preferences isn't wrong. Expressing an opinion isn't wrong. The preferences become problematic when we make them a big deal, when we make them a problem. That's all it takes to destroy the church. Now, one more for the evening. God is the one who gives the growth. No competing lighthouses allowed. God is the one who judges the structure, how the church is built and grows. And then it is God who shares His wealth and His wisdom. It's one of those great reversals. Ever been there where you think you've got something and then someone comes along and they say something that just completely reverses everything, turns it upside down? It's like in Luke 15 when the father says to the elder brother, everything I have is already yours. You just didn't know it. That's 1 Corinthians 3, 18 through 23. When we are told as God's people to stop boasting in men like Apollos or Paul, stop boasting in human wisdom and worldly ideas, like the wisdom of Athens in their day, the wisdom of, you name the philosophy today. But then the reversal is, you need to stop settling too. You're trying to belong to, I belong to Apollos, right? 1 Corinthians 1:13. I belong to Cephas when they belong to you. Now be careful, okay? I'd really like you not to go out this evening saying, well, Gantt belongs to me. We own Gantt. But he says, you have everything. What did he say in verse 5? They're servants for you, for God and for you. You have not just that, you have everything, including the world, life, death. Nothing's off the table. Why? Because you belong to God. God owns you, which then means you have the wisdom of God at your disposal and the wealth and the riches of the one who owns the whole universe. And you could throw in here some hints. Even later in this letter, he speaks of Christians judging the world. What does that mean? And that's later. You've got passages in Revelation that describe us reigning with Him someday. But the point here is, you need to stop living like spiritual beggars, trying to build yourself up by the division and the rivalry and the competition and seeking after worldly wisdom. You need to make sure you don't settle spiritually. Let's read it, and then we'll wrap things up. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 18 through 23. Here's what he says to them at the end in the great reversal. Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you thinks that he is wise in this age, if you're pretending, let him become a fool that he may become wise. There's some of that humility, and stop your pursuit of earthly ideas and wisdom. For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, he catches the wise in their craftiness. He goes to Job, and then he goes to possibly two different verses from Psalm 94 and says, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, and they are futile. So let no one boast in men, for all things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or present or the future. Even if you die, Jesus will resurrect you one day. Everything already belongs to you. Now, it isn't fully realized yet. There's that yet, not yet, that's throughout the New Testament scriptures, but it's yours already. And nothing in this world can truly take it from you. Can't happen. All are yours. And you are Christ. And Christ is God's. But we still sometimes use worldly metrics, don't we? But bigger isn't always better. Confidence is not always maturity. Things that are impressive to us as humans aren't always spiritually minded. Sometimes we allow worldly metrics to come into the church. And this blows it all away and says, stop settling. Realize that God shares his wisdom and his wealth with you. Now, just so we're all on the same page this evening, and there's by what metric they were supposed to be there. Did you get the title? I know it's an odd title. Somebody asked me this afternoon, what are you preaching tonight? And I said, gods. And they were thinking, okay, idol gods, or what does that mean? And I didn't mention there's an apostrophe there. There is an apostrophe on the handout, isn't there? Okay. All right. Because that's the reality of it all. The pride, the jealousy, the divisiveness, the strife, the competitiveness, the comparison games we play, the traditions we hold on to, everything about us is God's. In that the church belongs to God. As long as I act like that, then much of the rest eventually works its way out. What did we say at the beginning? The problem is when I act like the church belongs to me. It's God's. Jesus died for her, shed his blood for her. God gives the growth in her through us as we work and encourage one another. And now, the gospel calls us to worship and work and go out and live as the people who belong. Or, once more, pardon my phrasing, the people who are God's. We belong to him. Let's stand and sing together.